And now, the survival show that once survived a vicious bite from a pony. In this episode, Rhodes Carter of Iron Edison stops by to discuss the basics of solar power. We cover everything you need to know to start your journey and one big scam you should avoid. Howdy and welcome to the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 240. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Rhodes, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you, Aaron. Pleasure to be on the show today.
This is going to be great. Solar is something I'm really excited about. It's very intriguing. Everybody wants to get into solar these days. Preppers in particular are interested in solar for multiple reasons. They want redundancy, they want resilience, they want something to keep the lights on when the zombies march or whatever. And I think in some ways that's a noble goal, and it's definitely, power is such a huge part of our lives, and it is one of those things that we do want. But there's also the here and now factors, and you're with Iron Edison, and you guys do some really cool stuff. So it's great to finally have somebody on that I think can really speak to the audience intelligently about this whole solar thing, because it is so confusing for most people.
It can be, yeah. Solar, it's been around since, the 70s, if not even sooner than that. Back in those days, primarily for people who lived out in the sticks where it just was not possible or financially practical to get electricity there. So it was a very big financial pill to swallow to do a battery-based solar system back then. But the economics have really improved. So, there's people going solar, not just for the resilience and fault tolerance of being able to produce your own energy, or not even just for the green aspect of it, of producing your own electricity environmentally friendly and minimizing your carbon footprint. But even now, just in the last couple of years, the economics are getting to the point that going solar can actually save you money compared to using fossil fuels or the utility grid.
I'm glad we started off there, because solar has always seemed to me to be something that was really cool, but at the same time, it verged on being a pipe dream, and it was something that it felt like we were decades off from having as a viable solution. Am I wrong? Are we there yet? Or are we just like right there? Are we just starting to be there? Where are we with it?
The prices of solar panels, which are just one component in a complete solar system, have been dropping like you would not believe. To put it in perspective, roughly 10 years ago, you would pay close to $10 per watt for a solar panel. So if you had a 100 watt panel, you're paying hundreds of dollars for that, just 100 watts. Today, you can get solar panels on a retail level for 70 cents a watt.
Okay. All right.
And that's just over 10 years, and it keeps dropping tremendously.
To put it in perspective, when we're looking at these systems, your average, 1,500, 2,000 square foot home. I mean, I get, we're going to get into, there are a range of scenarios here, but when you're talking $10 a watt, if you don't know what a watt is or you don't know how many watts you need, that doesn't really sound like that much. How many watts do these systems typically, like where do they usually end up, so that we can start building kind of an idea in people's head?
That's a tough one to answer, Aaron. It's like asking someone, how much is it going to cost to furnish your home? It just depends on your standards and how much electricity you use. I talked to some people that might need maybe a 2 kilowatt solar system to power their 3,000 square foot house. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's people that might need a 10 kilowatt system to power a tiny home. It just depends on what your electrical consumption is. It's really not directly linked to the square footage of the property. It's how many people live there and what are your habits. But I would say it's typically measured in kilowatts. And of course, a kilowatt is 1,000 watts.
Yeah. Okay.
So typical residential homes, 2 kilowatts up to 10 kilowatts is what I typically see.
So, and that's good. I mean, yeah, there's a range, but I think that definitely helps put what is a watt and how do we start factoring that into getting a better understanding of what costs we're looking at here. What are the conditions where solar makes sense, where solar doesn't make sense for folks?
There's all kinds of variables there, and it really just depends on what your ultimate goals are. With the economics of it, it's making more sense for more people these days. compared to several years ago where the economics weren't necessarily there. So the prime motivating factors were your location in relationship to where grid power is available, or just you wanting to be green, minimizing your green footprint or your carbon footprint, or just, making your own energy, just kind of the cool factor of it, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So when somebody gets into solar, I think one of the first things that I found that kind of hits you in the face is it's not just put panels on and go off the grid, or it can be, or it might be something else, or it might be 10 other things. What are the different kinds of systems?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. People think just slap some solar panels on the roof, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Solar panels are just one component in the entire system that creates the electricity you need. And, kind of keep it on a high level, simple form. You can really break down the solar systems today into 3 different categories. First is the grid-tied, battery-less solar system. These are the simplest ones out there, the most cost-effective, but they do have their problems as well. After that, you have the off-grid, battery-based systems. These are typically used in remote locations where grid power is not present. There's a lot more a balance of system, we call it, to make that system function. And just in the last several years, we have a hybrid grid-tied battery-based solar systems as well, where you get the best of both worlds. They're a bit complicated, but the feature set is incredible with those hybrid systems.
Oh, cool. Well, let's start with grid-tied and dive into that.
By far the simplest, most common type of solar system in the U.S., I think roughly 90% of the solar systems in the U.S. are considered grid-tied, battery-less systems. Again, very simple. They consist of your solar array, typically on the roof, and an inverter called a grid-tied string inverter, or they also have microinverters out now as well. But basically the way they work is the solar array on the roof collects all the energy from the sun. The inverter then converts that to AC power that your home uses, and then the inverter just pumps that into your home. You use it live in real time, and then if designed properly, you're going to have a surplus generation from your solar array, meaning your solar is producing significantly more than what your home's actually consuming at that point in time. So all that surplus then goes back to the grid, passes backwards through your meter, literally spinning the meter backwards. So you're building up a credit. And then when, of course, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. So at the end of the day, the sun goes down, your solar's not producing your home's power anymore. So that's going to come in from the grid and, of course, spinning your meter forward. But instead of paying for that electricity, you're just using that credit that you built up several hours earlier when the sun was shining.
Mm-hmm. But is that the same in all, for the most part, in all 50 states, where all 50 states will say, let you build that credit? Or are there things, is that something that people need to watch out for, where they do a grid-tied system and basically during the day they're just pushing free money back into the grid?
It varies not just from state to state, but from local municipality or local utility to local utility.
Wow. Okay.
I have seen, just kind of, speaking on a high level, typically states that are more liberal leaning are more apt to provide net metering opportunities. Some of the more conservative states in the nation, it's a little more difficult to do that, or they're not as accommodating, if you will, to net metering agreements. But the net metering agreement, that is something that is absolutely mandatory if you're going to have a grid-tied battery-less solar system. You have to have the grid there to absorb that surplus production that you're producing, as well as provide electricity for you when the sun's not shining, because you do not have a battery there to store that energy. It has to come from somewhere, and it's either going to come from the grid or your array or a mixture of the two.
Mm-hmm. So what are the downsides? I mean, I guess the obvious one is that you've got no resiliency, really.
That's probably the biggest downfall to the grid-tied systems, and something that a lot of the national level solar companies that are really pushing these grid-tied systems are reluctant to share with their customers or potential customers. Of course, they all want to talk about the pros, the benefits to it, but probably the number one thing I hear from people who get one of these grid-tied solar systems, it's installed, there's a power outage, their lights go off as well, and they just don't understand why.
Mm-hmm. What other issues come up with grid-tied systems?
Besides the fault tolerance, another issue that we've been seeing more and more just in the last year or two is the net metering agreements. They are in a kind of a period of flux right now. The net metering concept originally started, well, roughly 15 years ago. The government mandated that utilities offer this. The utilities were kind of reluctant, but they looked at the big picture and thought, this is just a little drop in the bucket. Who cares? Fine, sure, we'll do this.
Mm-hmm.
Not counting on it literally exploding the way it has.
Mm-hmm.
And grid-tied solar industry has exploded so much that now it's becoming an issue for the utility companies.
How so?
A lot of people say the utilities, oh, you're just complaining because you're not making as much money as you think you should. But I used to work for a utility as well. I worked for an electricity wholesaler who is the one who actually generated electricity and then sold it on a wholesale level to local municipalities. And the variance in the generation is becoming a problem for them. They have to forecast not just days, but minutes in advance as to what the electrical loads are going to be. And with all this solar infrastructure on their grid that they have no control over, that makes their forecasting and generation a problem. It's much more challenging. And the other complaint that, I don't want to jump on the utilities bandwagon here, but it is a legitimate complaint that the utilities have. Utilities have two primary expenses, the electricity generation and then transmission. And folks that are doing net metering with a grid-tied solar system, they're basically using that infrastructure for free. Yes, the grid-tied folks are generating electricity and giving it back to the grid, and the grid is buying it at a retail price in a lot of places. But then you buy it back at a retail price, so effectively that customer's power bill is zero at the end of the month. So the utility is getting no revenue. However, they still have to provide the generation for that home for roughly 18 hours a day when the sun's not shining, and 100% of the transmission to receive that surplus production from the home and then deliver it back to the home during non-daylight hours.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of pushback now from the utilities to the Public Utilities Commission. And because of that, the net metering agreements are in flux, and they have been changing from state to state because of that.
See, that actually does make sense to me. I could see where, as a business, that would be really hard. Specifically, the one I'm talking about is where I've got to maintain the infrastructure for you, even though you're not a profit center for me, or maybe even a break-even point for me. Like it's like, well, now I'm just, what the hell am I doing here?
Exactly. A couple states that have done some things that have really gotten the news lately in the solar industry. Nevada, specifically, their net metering agreements changed recently to where instead of having this retail for retail agreement with the customers, now it's the case that the customer can sell all of 100% of their solar production to the grid at a wholesale price. And then they have to buy the energy literally they just produced back from the utility at a retail price, which on a business level, there is justification for that. But for the homeowner who bought and installed this grid-tied solar system with the intention that they're going to get 20 years of a retail for retail agreement, getting the carpet ripped out from underneath them, they're not happy campers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody just changed the rules of the game, literally, on them.
Exactly.
Wow,
and Hawaii is another prime example. Of course, Hawaii has a very unique infrastructure, being a relatively small island with antiquated grid infrastructure and utility prices that are just through the roof. They run probably 50 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity out there from the utility, where the national average in the continental U.S. is about 12 cents.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, everyone's putting solar out there.
Right.
And that just is exponentially more difficult for the utility to manage all this unregulated generation on their small grid. So they just one day cut off all new solar grid tie connections, even people that were mid-construction.
Oh, wow.
I talked to a number of people who had bought the system. It was in the process of being installed or just finished installed and ready for the final inspection. And then this came down the pipe, and now they're making payments on a system they financed, and they can't even turn it on.
Oh, ow.
So,
ow.
That's just a couple examples of things that are happening in the net metering world. I'm not saying this is going to happen to everyone everywhere in the country.
Right.
It's very localized and specific. But, I would be very reluctant to get into a grid-tied 20-year agreement today, seeing this stuff on the horizon, because, I can't guarantee it, but it's a pretty certain thing that the grid-tied net metering agreement you're going to get into today may not necessarily be the same 10, 20 years down the road through your agreement.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of put a fine head on this before we move on to the next type, as far as grid tied, it's sounding to me like if you're only interested in the green aspect of it, reducing your carbon footprint, or as I like to say, just being a good shepherd of your environment, does grid tied make any kind of financial sense at all? Like, is it a net positive? Is it a net neutral? Or are you, and speaking in generalities here?
In general, you will save a little bit of money every month doing a grid tied system. Yes, you are going to be making your own energy, reducing your carbon footprint, and eliminating or significantly reducing your electricity bill. Of course, the money you're saving by not having to pay that power bill is most likely going to go toward paying for the system in some way, shape, or form, either through a loan payment or if you do a solar lease, which we'll probably get into in a minute here. But there's lots of variables there. Typically, you should save a little bit per month. But really, the main motivating factor for doing the grid-tied solar systems is to just be green and produce your own energy. And again, there's kind of a cool factor to it. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a conversation piece in the neighborhood when you put solar panels on your roof. All your neighbors come over, it's like, "Oh, what are you doing? That's pretty cool. Tell me about it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We'll be back after this quick break. Listener, do you get at least $3 a month worth of value out of ITRH? You should see what we do for the Roving Horde Armada members. Check it out today by visiting itrh.net. Members get access to episodes a day early, access to monthly virtual and in-person meetups in some areas, an invitation to the secret ITRH Armada Facebook group so you can chat about survival all day long with like-minded people. Access to every episode ever produced by ITRH. That's right, all the way back to the beginning, including one that was never aired. And those are just a few things you get with your membership when you sign up and become part of the ITRH Roving Horde by going to itrh.net. Again, that's itrh.net. So let's move to the big sexy, at least for our audience, which is to go off-grid and to be self-sufficient. Let's start talking about that.
All right. Yeah. The off-grid battery-based systems, completely different beast. Instead of just having your solar panels and an inverter that's directly inverting that DC power into AC and powering the home, battery-based systems are much more complicated. And why I found the best way for people to just understand what an off-grid battery-based system is, don't think of your home as being solar powered at all. Because in the grand scheme of things, it's not directly solar powered. Think of your home as being battery powered, and you've got solar panels that recharge the battery each day.
Okay. All right. That's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, because your battery is basically an energy storage tank, kind of like a water tank. And what you have connected to that battery is an inverter that inverts that DC power stored in the battery to the AC power that your home uses to power your home 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. Now, during the night and the evening, you're going to be drawing that battery down with the inverter to run your lights, your cooking, your television, whatever your loads may be. And then first thing in the morning, that battery is probably going to be fairly low. The sun's going to come up, hit the solar panels, and then for the 4 to 6 hours typically you have of peak sun each day, the solar panels are just going to recharge that battery back up to full again.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you able at this point, like let's say if somebody was thinking about this for the city, are you able to even cut yourself off from the grid in a city? And again, we're speaking in generalities.
Some places, yes. Some places, no. It really depends on what rules and regulations the local government has put into place. Typically, those are being driven by the utility company.
Right.
I know here in Colorado, there's some places that you are required to be connected to the grid. It's kind of old school thinking. The logic behind it is if you don't have electricity, you don't have refrigeration and your food's going to go bad, and that's a health issue. So they use that logic to mandate that you are connected to the grid.
Okay.
Now, how much energy you use from the grid, that's a whole other conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beyond the obvious, at least for our audience, it's a point of resilience in your life. What are the other advantages of being, completely off grid?
Complete energy independence. You're not dependent on anything else outside of your property. If you are a completely off-grid battery-based system, really the only thing you're reliant upon is the sun coming up in the morning. to make your own electricity. All hell can break loose outside of your little world, your bubble, and it doesn't impact your ability to have electricity at all.
How long, you brought up a great point about the sun comes up tomorrow, and now I have a Little Orphan Annie song stuck in my head. What, and hopefully now the entire audience does too. Again, generalities, how long can you go on, a week of, or a couple of days of rain or whatever? How long can you actually go realistically on one of these systems?
People that are living off grid, they are much more dialed in to what electricity they're using.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's going to be several days of bad weather in the forecast, like, well, we should, probably be more conservative with what we're doing. We're not going to turn on the electric space heaters or cook anything on the electric range.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's really not a time base. It's just, your battery is a tank and it'll hold X amount of energy and you use it at the rate you use it at.
Mm-hmm.
So that battery, depending on your usage, could last, 2 hours. It could last 2 weeks or more. Just depends on how much you're using.
Mm-hmm. What are the other downsides of it? Because it sounds pretty cool.
Off-grid systems, they're great because you're completely independent and you have electricity in remote locations where you may not have the grid because it's not logistically possible or financially impractical to extend the grid there. But the cons to battery-based systems, they are much more complicated. There's probably 2 to 3 times the balance of system. We call it, inverters, charge controllers, the battery. And because of all that extra equipment involved to make the system work, obviously there's going to be a bit more price. In generalities, an equal-sized battery-based off-grid solar system can cost 2, maybe even 4 times as much as a grid-tied battery-less system we were speaking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because of all the components involved. Mainly the big one is the battery. Batteries can typically be about 50% of the total material cost of an off-grid solar system.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's something that most people don't realize when they're just taking an initial cursory glance at solar. They look at, like we were talking about earlier, they look at the cost of the panels and say, wow, the cost of the panels are coming down. And it's like, yeah, but you need those batteries if you're going to do off-grid.
Correct. Yeah. Panels in the grand scheme of things are dirt cheap these days. It's the other components in the system that are making up the bulk of the cost.
Mm-hmm.
Prices on those other components are coming down as well, not nearly as fast as the price of solar panels are, but they are coming down.
And I think you talked about balancing a system, and I think we can go down a little bit of a rabbit hole with this just because it is important. And I know I get frustrated with it, and a lot of people get frustrated with it depends. But electricity is a very tricky thing and a very complicated thing to look at, especially when we're looking at homes and our increasingly energy hungry lives. So when you talk about balancing a system, are you also having to look at, what kind of energy consumption a home is doing? What is the lifestyle of the people in it? Is that also what you mean by balancing, or is that a separate thing?
The balance of system I was speaking earlier, that's basically the electronics that make up the solar system.
Mm-hmm.
The inverters, the charge controllers, the battery bank itself, the rest of the system above and beyond the solar panels.
Oh,
basically,
okay.
That's what that is.
What are the things that people really have to look at when they're looking at, a solar system and their lifestyle?
The first step in designing a solar system properly is we need to know how much energy you're going to use per day.
Mm-hmm.
And having said that, let's back up a second. One thing I see a lot of confusion with is a difference between power and energy. So power is basically the amount of electricity using at one particular second in time. For example, if you have a 100 watt incandescent light bulb, that light bulb takes 100 watts of power to turn it on.
Mm-hmm.
Energy is power over time. So if you want to have that 100 watt light bulb on for 1 hour, it's going to take 100 watt hours of energy to power that light bulb.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. That is an important distinction.
Now, having said that, we then need to know how much energy in watt hours or kilowatt hours a home or whatever the project may be is going to consume in a 24-hour period of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first step in designing a system, is how much energy does the system need to deliver each day?
Okay. All right. That makes sense. So let's talk about hybrid systems. I know that's, kind of the best of both worlds. Let's walk into that.
A hybrid system, that's a new product or new concept that's come up in the last few years, mainly due to advancements in inverter technology. A hybrid system, basically starts out like an off-grid battery-based system that we were speaking about a few minutes ago,
Hmm.
where you've got your solar panels that are recharging a battery, and then the battery is discharged to power the home using an inverter.
Hmm.
Now, that inverter, there's a new type of inverter out there now called a multi-mode inverter. It has the ability to, instead of just powering the home from the battery, if there's surplus power, it can sell that back to the grid, or it can buy energy from the grid if the battery gets too low.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a much more intelligent inverter.
It is, yes. If I could kind of mentally draw out one of these inverters for you, this inverter, it has its AC output that powers the home or whatever the loads may be. It has an AC input that's connected to the grid, which is bidirectional. It can push energy out to the grid or pull energy in from the grid.
Hmm.
It'll also have a second AC input for a backup generator, and then it has its connection to the battery and the solar array. And based on the programming of this multi-mode inverter, it can choose between the battery, the grid, or the generator and prioritize those to keep the loads up and running in the home.
I just got goosebumps. That's very sexy. Please continue.
It is a really cool product. So the way we program most of them, and you can, I call it the Swiss Army knife of inverters, because really your imagination is almost the limit as to what you can make this thing do. You can use your battery power from solar down to maybe like 50% of the battery's capacity. Then you want to keep that reserve in case the grid goes down, but the grid's up, so it can stop using battery and start using the grid, keeping that battery on reserve. If the grid goes down, it's going to fail back over to the battery again instantly. You won't even notice. And as the battery continues to discharge, it'll reach a point where, hey, it's getting kind of a critical position here. I'm going to start up this generator I have connected to me automatically, and then use that generator to power the home and recharge the battery. Because if the battery got this discharged, well, the solar's not doing it, obviously. The grid's not there. Let's get this thing back up with the generator. So the generator will fire up, bring the battery back up to 100% state of charge. Once that's done, the inverter will switch back over to the battery powering the home, shut the generator off, and then just wait as the battery discharges and it hits the appropriate trigger point to fail over to whatever you tell it to.
Oh, wow. Okay. So is this for all this hot sexy, are we starting to get into the world of even more expensive, or is it somewhere in between? How does that work out?
That system is going to be just slightly more expensive than a typical off-grid system.
Okay.
Because the only difference between the off-grid and the hybrid is the multi-mode inverter. And it is a little bit more expensive, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal.
Does it pay for itself over time? How does it, is there a cost savings involved in it? Kind of, where does that go?
It depends on if you're, how you're interacting with the grid and if you have a net metering agreement. These hybrid systems, they work great in situations where you may not have a net metering option from your utility, but you still want to have a solar system, because you can program it to do a zero sell. So you won't sell any energy back to the grid, but you can pull energy in if you need it.
Okay.
So, the finances of it goes, it really depends on your location, site-specific conditions of what it costs to install it and what the benefits are from installing it. There's some places where there is a cost benefit to doing that. Other places, maybe not.
I gotcha. So is there a downside to doing a system like this?
Really, the downside to the hybrid battery-based systems is cost. If you're in a place where the grid's very unreliable and your grid, and it's going down a lot and you need some fault tolerance, then absolutely, yes. That's definitely a good way to go. And another thing that a lot of people will do to kind of make a hybrid system like this more cost effective, you don't need to size the system to power your entire home in the event of an outage. You can have this multi-mode inverter just power critical loads. So if the grid goes down for some reason, your luxury items, like most of the lighting in the home, maybe your entertainment center, depends on what your priorities are, those will go down with the grid. But critical things like food storage, your fridge, your freezer, some critical lighting, maybe communications, those will be on a battery backup system. and will stay up even if the grid goes down and run on the battery.
Okay. So, and I know I'm going to get a little technical here. I'm just curious. So is this more sort of, so we're starting to work more like the emergency backup generators where you're powering up specific circuits in some sort of failover box.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. The way those systems are typically designed, you have your main service panel or your main breaker panel, which every house has.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to do a critical loads backup type of model, you would have a separate critical loads breaker panel. And that critical loads breaker panel is powered directly by the inverter in the solar system.
Okay.
And then the inverter is picking and choosing which energy source to use to power that critical load. So either the grid, which will probably be 99% of the time. If the grid fails, then it goes over to the battery, what have you.
Mm-hmm. Where do we end up with? Here was a problem I ran into years ago when I was looking at potentially doing an extremely large commercial solar system. Was when the grid went down, the whole thing went down, and there was an issue where, and even when we were talking, this was quite some time ago, but even when we were looking at it with a battery system, they were like, yeah, if it goes down, your whole system goes down, even though you have a big battery system. What has that changed?
A little bit, and the multi-mode inverters have really revolutionized that. The big concern that utilities have, and is why it's now a National Electric Code requirement, is that any solar system that's grid interactive must have qualified grid power, quote unquote, in order for them to be operational. And it's a safety thing for the utility workers. Mm-hmm. If there's a grid outage for whatever reason, there's something wrong with the grid infrastructure, and there's going to be human beings out there working on what they think are de-energized lines. Mm-hmm. If your solar system does not follow that NEC requirement and it just keeps producing solar electricity and pumping it out to the grid when the grid's down, you're gonna light those guys up and they won't be happy.
Yeah. They will be dead, kind of not happy.
Exactly. Yeah. And taking that to another level, just the physics of electricity. If the grid goes down and they're producing megawatts of power to power the entire city, and your little 5 kilowatt solar system is still functioning, the entire city is going to try and pull all of its electricity from your 5 little kilowatt solar system, and you're going to fry your solar system.
Okay. All right. So even if you don't care about that poor lineman, you're just some kind of complete ass, you're also ruining your own equipment at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. Your equipment doesn't have the ability to do all the frequency and voltage regulation that the utility does. Mm-hmm. Your system, grid-tied string inverters, they're inexpensive, and in the grand scheme of things, they're dumb. They just pump out as much juice as they can. They don't care because they know or expect the utility to be there to absorb and do all that regulation for them. But if your system is just by itself pumping juice out, the frequency and the voltage is going to be all over the place, and you could very viably pull more energy out of it than it's capable of producing and wind up frying it.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And that was something I didn't even know. I knew about the lineman issue just from having tried to deal with a large install, but I didn't know about that other issue that you could fry your own system. Is it getting smarter? And by that, I mean, having dealt with a bunch of backup generators, the backup generators that we put in a commercial setting had some sort of, I don't remember what we called it, but it was some sort of smart switch where it cut you off from the grid if the grid went down before it brought up the generator. And then the system would monitor that line and it would take the generator down before it switched you back over to the grid so that you didn't have backfeeding issues where you were pumping energy into a de-energized grid. Is that the case with solar, or because I'm a little murky about the stuff with the national rules about that?
Yeah, the auto transfer switch is what you're talking about with the generator. What that does, it's basically a hard A-B switch. Mm-hmm. And it's switching between either the grid power in your home or the generator power in your home. There's no physical way in that auto transfer switch for the generator to be directly connected to the grid. Mm-hmm. With the solar systems, especially grid-tied systems, they are designed to push energy out to the grid. And that's where we come into all the weirdness. And we need to make sure that it sees the grid power present before it comes alive and starts producing electricity, because it's designed to be connected directly to the grid where the generator is not. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, in order for them to become active, When the generator's running in your auto transfer switch scenario, the grid's down, the grid comes back up, that auto transfer switch is monitoring, just like you said, and then it's going to wait about 5 minutes to quote unquote qualify the grid. Right soon after a grid outage, typically the voltage comes back up, and it's going to be fluctuating quite a bit because all these heavy loads are coming back on, and the grid has to deal with that. So the voltage and the frequency need to be normalized for about 5 minutes before the transfer switch says, okay, it's safe. Now it's going to instantly switch your house back over to the grid. And then depending on the manufacturer, the generator will probably have a cool down time where it runs for 30 seconds or a couple minutes before it actually shuts off. That's with generators. The same qualified grid power concept happens with the multi-mode inverters in a hybrid solar system, and even just the string inverters in a grid-tied system. It needs to see grid power there, and it needs to see it within a certain voltage and frequency parameter for a period of time. 3 to 5 minutes is typical, depending on the manufacturer. Once it's satisfied that, then the grid-tied systems, they'll start selling energy to the grid or just start producing energy, period. Or the hybrid systems, that's when they can start interacting with the grid, either pulling energy in or pushing out whatever they're programmed to do.
Okay. So does having that multi-mode inverter in your system get you around the issue of, if the grid goes down, even though you're on solar or have solar, it still cuts you off? Does this get you around that?
It does, in a way. As I said earlier, you've got your main service panel, and then you've got your critical load service panel. In a grid outage, what's going to happen is the inverter is going to see, hey, the grid went down. Okay, well, I'm just going to, island myself from the grid, which means that your main service panel that's connected to the grid is going to go dark. So, the majority of the loads in your home will go off.
Okay.
But whatever is on your critical loads panel is going to be kept up because the inverter saw the grid went down. It switched over and is sending battery power directly to that critical loads panel, which is completely isolated from the grid.
Okay.
And because that critical loads panel is completely isolated, we can keep it alive and keep those certain loads up, even when the grid is not up.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. What's the other big pitfall or pitfalls that people look at this, they start getting into it, they start getting excited, or there's something that excites them and they think I can do this. And really, in the end, it ends up being like, it was not a good idea.
A lot of marketing out there these days from national level solar companies are pumping, you can get a solar system on your home for zero money down. And what that is, it is a solar lease where instead of buying the solar system, you're going to be leasing the solar system from one of these big, typically national level solar companies. And on the surface, that sounds great. I don't need to worry about getting a loan or coughing up, thousands of dollars. I can just, sign on the dotted line. They come put a solar system on my roof. I don't have to maintain it, quote unquote, which is another thing they really pump. And then you just pay a monthly lease, which is supposed to be lower than what your old power bill was. Sounds great, doesn't it?
That sounds really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what they don't want you to know is they're locking you into a 20-year agreement. People complain about a 2-year agreement on their cell phones. This is 20 years.
Oh, gosh. Wow. Okay.
And you are going to be paying, it varies from case to case, but just for round numbers, we'll say you're going to be paying 25% less per month in the lease than you would be paying your power bill. So you're saving 25% for the next 20 years. That's great. The reality is the money you're paying them, if you took that same dollar amount that you're paying in a lease and put it toward a loan payment, you'd have it paid off in typically 7 to 10 years instead of paying it for 20 years. And by buying it and financing it over 7 to 10 years, you own that system. So if you lease it, 20-year lease is up, well, you don't own that system anymore. So you've got an option. You can either buy a 20-year-old solar system from these guys, or they can come take it off the roof. The other big disadvantage to leasing, there is just all kinds of phenomenal incentive programs out there these days for doing renewable energy systems. But that only applies to people who own the system.
Oh,
if
tricky.
you are leasing the system, you don't get the 30% investment tax credit off your federal income taxes or the literally thousands of other programs that are out there. A lot of people can take, a third to 50% off the price of their system with all these incentives if you own it.
Hmm.
If you lease it, the solar company owns it. They're the ones getting all those incentives.
Tricky. Very tricky.
Yep.
Hmm.
So, yeah, leases, it sounds great on the surface, but personally, I wouldn't wish a solar lease on my enemies. It's probably the worst thing you could do.
Yeah, that sounds
I would rather just stay on the grid with no solar system at all than getting a solar lease, but that's just my opinion.
You brought up a good point there about how long that lease is for. What are the longevities of these systems? I mean, you want to know that anytime you buy anything, right? So
absolutely,
these are going to be big investments in most cases. How long do they last in general?
Every component's going to be a little different.
Okay.
We'll just go right through the entire electrical chain, starting with the solar panels on the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Solar panels will have a 25 to 30 year life expectancy. Most manufacturers today will do a 10-year warranty on craftsmanship and manufacturing, and they'll have a 25-ish, give or take, year performance warranty.
Okay.
There's solar panels from the 1970s that are still out there working great today. Because there's no moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, the sun rays hit the photovoltaic cell, excites electrons, they start moving around, and moving electrons is what electricity is.
Mm-hmm.
In general, solar panels are going to lose about 1% of their production capability per year. That's just due to degradation of being out in the sun all the time. So a 20-year-old panel will have roughly 80% of its power output that it did when it was brand new. It's still pumping out juice, just not quite as much.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's solar panels. In the grid-tied systems that are real simple, the only other component is the string inverter or the grid-tied inverter. Life expectancy of those is typically about 15 years. Might be a little bit more.
Okay.
If that's under normal, typical installation conditions. The inverters and charge controllers for off-grid systems can be roughly the same. The installation conditions are usually a little worse because you're in an off-grid cabin instead of hanging it on the wall in your garage in an urban environment. I have seen systems that are in what I would call a drafty woodshed type of installation have maybe a 10-year life.
Okay.
If you have it in a cleaner, climate-controlled mechanical room, 15-ish years, maybe a little more for the electronics, the balance of system we were speaking about earlier. The next big component, and this is really just for battery-based systems, is the battery itself. Right now, and has been for quite a while, kind of this industry standard go-to is a lead-acid-based battery, very similar to what you have in your car or your RV, except it's a deep cycle instead of the shallow cycle starter battery that you have. Those batteries are relatively cheap. You can expect about 5 years of life out of them. That's it.
And that's not that great because, as you said earlier, like that's a big part of the cost of a system.
It is, yeah. A lot of systems, batteries can be upwards of 50% of the price of the entire system. And if you want your system to last 20 to 30 years, which is realistic for everything but the battery, then you're dropping, 30 to 50% of your system cost every 5 years to buy a new battery for your system if you have an off-grid system and you're cycling that battery every day.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in one of the hybrid categories, where you're grid tied and have a battery in your system as well, but the battery is just there for a backup where you're not cycling it every day, but just when the grid goes down, maybe, a handful of times a year, you can get more life out of the battery.
Okay. Are these systems, and I guess just to stick with one to make life easy for the listeners, let's go with hybrid. Is it something that you can add to the system and build up the system over time? If somebody was like, I want to get into it, but I'm not ready to dump, all this money all at once. Is it something they can build over time?
There are some caveats to expansion, but absolutely. Yes, you can scale up systems down the road. Typically, you want to add on with identical manufacturer or specific model of components, which can be an issue because say you start out with a base system today and 5 years down the road, you want to expand it. Well, shoot, that particular model of inverter I have is no longer available.
Okay.
And when you're stacking multiple inverters like that, they need to communicate with each other in order to work properly.
Okay.
The different components of the system, solar, yeah, you can expand that all you want. That's no big deal. Batteries have a lot of caveats to them as far as expanding. You have to match the voltage, the chemistry, ideally the exact make and model of the battery to intermix them. Otherwise, you can introduce some weirdness if you don't do that.
What's an example of weirdness?
If you have, say, for example, a 500 amp hour battery bank that's in place right now, and if you want to expand, you need to put in another 500 amp hour battery bank. It needs to be the same size. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the batteries will get out of balance from each other. A good analogy is, say you've got two 500-gallon water tanks. Mm-hmm. Both of them are filling and draining at the same rate. If they're not the same size tanks, one of them is going to be empty before the other one is. And as you're filling them, the smaller one's going to overflow before the big one's full.
Okay.
Not the best analogy, but it kind of gets the point across of why they need to be identical.
Okay. Somebody's interested in this. Where do they begin? Where would you recommend people begin if they're like, I want to investigate this more? How do I start?
Probably the best thing to do is talk to a local solar professional, or you could even reach out to my employer, Edison Battery Company. We specialize in battery-based, typically off-grid, but not necessarily off-grid systems. We can basically take you from the initial tire kicking stage to delivering a complete solar system on your doorstep. We don't do the installation, but we can design and sell you all the products and components for that system, and even work with a local solar installer if you have a preference to get the system up and running for you.
Okay. So is that something where somebody contacts you? Do y'all have to come out to the location, or is it something y'all can use Google Earth to kind of figure out, or how does that work?
Google Earth is a wonderful thing.
Yes, it is.
It has made site visits for doing solar system design not necessary anymore. Sometimes it's a good idea if there's some interesting caveats to the site that you need to have boots on the ground to look at it. But for the most part, between Google Earth, doing a load calculation where we calculate how much energy you use per day, that can typically be done just by looking at power bills, or we even have a load calculation worksheet that we provide our prospective customers, where you literally go around the house counting light bulbs, counting TVs, refrigerators, and put them in a spreadsheet, and it calculates how much energy we anticipate you using on a daily basis.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. You mentioned that y'all are mostly focused on the batteries, and we talked about the problems with lead acid batteries. What's different about y'all's batteries?
Edison has two alternative chemistry batteries that provide much longer life than the typical lead acid batteries. And we've seen a huge surge in interest in alternative chemistry batteries in general across the entire industry. The big motivating factor for this is energy storage is becoming a hot item, a hot topic of discussion. And secondly, people are just getting sick and tired of dropping money every 5 years to replace a battery that's made out of lead and acid. It's not the most environmentally correct energy storage solution. So Iron Edison was founded almost 10 years ago with the nickel iron battery chemistry. This is a battery that Thomas Edison invented back in the early 1900s. It is a very long life battery. We promote 30 plus years of life expectancy from that battery. In reality, you'll get more than that. Literally, there are World War II era nickel iron batteries still running today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's a very rugged, heavy duty, robust, simple design. So if you have people that are concerned about an apocalyptic event coming along and wanting to keep their electricity, that's definitely the good choice, because with 30 plus years of life, it'll be the last battery you buy, is what we say.
Okay.
The next battery chemistry that's really hot these days is lithium ion. And what a lot of people don't realize is lithium ion, that term is actually an umbrella term for about 6 different lithium chemistries. And people hear lithium, they think, oh, no, I don't want my house to burn down or catch on fire like the hoverboard or my Samsung Galaxy did. Those devices that use what's called a lithium cobalt chemistry, lithium cobalt has the highest energy density, making it as small as possible and hold as much energy as possible, which is great for mobile devices like that. However, it makes it unstable. And if that battery chemistry has a catastrophic failure, typically caused by overcharging, well, watch the news. You know what happens.
Right.
And that is why with our lithium battery that we carry, it's a different lithium chemistry. It's a lithium iron phosphate. It's not as high energy density, so it's a little bit bigger, still substantially smaller than other battery options compared to our nickel iron batteries or lead acid batteries. You can get the same energy storage in about 1/3 the footprint.
Oh, wow. Okay.
With our lithium batteries. It's still, a large battery. They're typically the size of a coffee table up to like a construction site job box, but that's going to power your entire home for a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason we went with lithium iron phosphate, in the event of a catastrophic failure with lithium iron phosphate, the only thing you're going to get is venting steam. No fire, no self-sustaining fire like lithium cobalt, where it's producing its own oxygen. It's almost impossible to extinguish. You need a special Class D fire extinguisher, or just sit back, shed a tear, and watch your house burn.
Oh, God. Wow. Okay. I was just imagining the last time I almost burned our house down. So yeah, there's a lot of sphincter puckering there. So, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, the lithium batteries that we have, the lithium iron phosphate, much, much safer. And, you pay for it with a little bit larger size, but hey, we're okay with that. Mm-hmm. We don't want your house to burn.
Yeah. Burning down, not good. Not good.
Yeah. And life expectancy depends on how deep you discharge it and if you do it daily or not. But 15 to 20 years is a typical life expectancy for our lithium iron phosphate batteries. Still substantially better than the 5 years for lead acid batteries that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and like you said, y'all do a lot more than y'all's main focus is batteries, but y'all do a lot more than batteries. How does somebody says this Rhodes guy sounds cool, sounds like he's on top of things, knows what he's talking about. I don't feel like I'm going to get jacked around with these guys. How does somebody get in touch with you and begin the process of learning more, kicking the tires, as you say, and maybe finding out if solar is the right way for them to go?
We've got a pretty good website that covers our different batteries and just all the different solar components out there. And there's also some educational material on our website as well. So I would suggest that'd be a great starting point. It's ironedison.com. Take a look at that. And we have got a whole team of system designers. We just love to talk to people on the phone and, find out what you want to accomplish and help you to get to that ultimate goal that you have. The one thing I really enjoy about working at Iron Edison is, unlike a lot of other solar companies where they just want to rubber stamp the same system over and over and over, I have got all kinds of different arrows in my quiver, and I love getting challenges. It makes the day exciting and fun. If I'm just rubber stamping systems over and over, that's boring.
Yeah.
I like the curveballs. I want the unique challenges and come up with a solution to meet that goal.
Well, this audience loves to give people unique challenges. So what's that website address one more time so that they can give you some unique challenges?
Yeah, the website again is ironedison.com. ironedison.com. No dashes or spaces or anything in there. It's all slammed together as one word.
Awesome. Rhodes, man, I look forward to talking to you some more about this in the future, but this was really just such a great start. I really appreciate you guys coming on today and telling us the high level stuff of solar.
Absolutely, Aaron. I had a good time too. I'm looking forward to chatting with you some more. And, as we said off air before, let's get down on the weeds and some technical stuff. And I could talk about solar all day. I love doing this job, and it's fun talking to people and helping them understand and get their head around what these systems are and what they can do and what they can do with systems like this.
Perfect. Show notes, links to Iron Edison, and other resources from this episode can be found by going to intherabbithole.com/E240. Support the show and get ITRH Roving Horde Armada members-only benefits. Like what, you ask? Great question! Like twice monthly virtual hangs, access to the secret ITRH Armada Facebook group, and access to the on-demand bug-out bag class. And that's just to name a few things you get when you go to itrh.net to become part of the Roving Horde Armada. Now, a bit more about the virtual hangs. Twice a month, members get on a private, secure video chat to talk about guns, current events, mead, food storage, the 50 caliber Beowulf, or whatever's on their mind. Go to itrh.net to read more. Again, that's itrh.net to find out about the exclusive members-only benefits. With that, we wrap up episode number 240. from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.